everyone who has come this morning to History Matters and So Does Coffee. We have our special guest, Heather Cox Richardson, who it is a joy to welcome, and I love working with her, so this is a good thing. And as announced on Twitter and possibly in other places as well, we're going to be talking about transitions, historical transitions, and some of the insights that they could give us about moments of transition, like the one that we're interestingly having right now. And so I'll talk about an earlier one, a moment of transition. I think Heather might be talking about a later one. And then as always, we'll open things up for questions. But before we begin, as always, I shall turn things over to Matt, my partner in crime, who will describe the rules of the game for asking questions, and then we can begin. So Matt, I toss this to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you, Heather, for joining us this morning. It's always wonderful to have you here. And last time was a lot of fun. So we're looking forward to a great episode. Let's see. Rules of the game. Generally, we do encourage you to use chat. So if this is your first time, make sure that you're using chat to talk about things that Heather and Joanne are talking about. And but of course, keep it family friendly and germane to our conversation here today. Additionally, if you do have questions, we do have a Q&A section, but please put your questions in the Q&A that can be found at the bottom of your screen by clicking on Q&A. Excuse me, I apologize. That's where we're going to take all the questions. So don't put your questions in chat. Make sure you put them in Q&A. And two last comments before I give my usual spiel about NCHE and how wonderful we are, because we are. The first is a quick reminder, December 17th, we're having a huge event, which we're really excited about. We're going to be joined by Pete Souza for a conversation about presidential photography as primary sources. Should be a really exciting event. So I want to make sure everybody puts that on their calendar, including Heather, who is, I'm sure, jotting this down right now. This is December 17th at 7 p.m. We're gonna have a great conversation with Pete Souza. The other thing that I wanted to mention is we are working on getting this closed captioning thing figured out for folks who need support in hearing. So I put a link in the chat, and I will put it again for anybody who needs to have the closed captioning for this event today, so that you can follow along. Yes, I've heard the website's been a little overloaded. I apologize for that.
This is you. You've overloaded the website.
She has. This is so. Hopefully, this gets fixed. Yeah, I had a couple emails here. Last but not least, if you do enjoy what we do here at National Council for History Education, please make sure you visit our website when it's functioning. And apparently it's being a little stubborn this morning. But please join us on our website, www.ncheteach.org, and peruse. You can find all the old episodes from this show, along with webinars, courses, all kinds of different things. And of course, we do have our 2021 conference coming up in April. We're looking forward to a great event, and you can find out more about that on our website. You can follow us on social media at History Ed, which is our Twitter handle, and at Facebook is NC4HE. And that is all I have. So I will turn it over to Joanne and Heather, and we'll have a great conversation this morning.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. And I wonder if I were faster while you were talking, I would have sent out a tweet or something saying, if you're having trouble getting in, keep trying because we know, or something, but I'm really slow. But Matt's like, yeah, I took the hint, Joanne. Thank you, Matt. I didn't know. And Liz, thank you for saying that. I didn't know. Newbie is the history baby Yoda of 2020. I will accept that.
Just responded to that.
Yes, Newbie is accepting it too because he's quiet. Okay, so welcome everybody. Obviously the topic for today was not difficult to pick. Transitions, political transitions. I used the word transition, but hesitated to, because in a way it's a euphemism. What we're talking about is the transition of power. So the power part is an important component in what we're looking at here. It's not some simple transition. It actually has meaning to it. And granted, we're watching the Biden administration prepare itself with or without funding, but still, transition, I think, is kind of a euphemism. At any rate, Heather and I thought that we would talk a little bit about difficult transition moments in the past and what they looked like and what insight they may or may not give us. And then, as always, open things up and have more of a conversation about it. Now, you and I, Heather, have not really planned partly because I was so late in getting my act together in arranging this. I guess it makes sense probably for me to talk about 1800 and then to jump ahead in time.
Yeah, and I hope you don't mind if I ask questions about 1800 because it's such a big deal.
It is a big deal. And, you know, so I've written about it in my first book. There's a whole chapter about it, and I've studied it for a long time. The resonance over the years in 2000 and now clearly has changed. And you'll hear regarding a piece of evidence that I found when I was trying to prepare for this morning. But yeah, it's a big deal because it does represent the first real transition of power between political alliances, not quite parties, but still between Federalists and Republicans. It was after a moment of extreme polarization. It was the first really contested election. It really rang a lot of alarm bells. It really led people to question whether things would be able to continue on. It was a big, big deal in a lot of ways that I think have been sort of lost to history. I know I've remarked before, and maybe even on here, because I think once before I talked about the lead up to that election when we were in the lead up to this one. But there are all sorts of fears and threats and any number of things linked to that election that people miss. And that I think now in the context of what's happening now are kind of striking. So let me, Tom says, you guys don't need to prepare. No, we do.
Didn't his opponents say that Jefferson was going to cancel God?
Yeah, well, indeed. So yes. So as this was happening, when at some point there was some charge on some part by some person that if Biden won, there would be no God.
Jefferson, I think you meant.
No.
Oh, okay.
Jefferson did, but it was about Jefferson. But there was a recent comment along those lines, which is what led me back to Jefferson, right? Because I saw someone saying religion would be gone if there's a Biden presidency, and right along the lines of what Heather said, I was like, oh, I've seen that message before. So I went back in time, and indeed, and I think I posted it on Twitter a while back. There was a campaign like motto, and it said, Adams and religion, or Jefferson and no God. it's pretty blunt. So that idea and that fear and that hint at morality going down the tank. So religion is kind of coded in, not just religion, but morality too. That goes all the way back too. But so as Heather said, the election of 1800 at the time was a big deal. And when you look at it in detail, it is. I've talked before and I've written before about the fact that, among other things, lots of letters between people in the lead up to the election, in their letters, were using the words civil war and anarchy. And I remember keeping track of how many times I found those words, because there were a lot. And basically I wanted to see, is this me responding, or is there an actual lot of evidence? And the fact is there was a lot of evidence, which gives you a sense of the mood of that time. And I've written before about the fact that there was talk that in Pennsylvania and Virginia, they were preparing arms in case the government needed to be taken for Jefferson by the time there was a tie. And let me back up for a moment and say what happens in that election is you have Adams and Pinckney on one side, you have Burr and Jefferson on the other side. So Adams and Pinckney Federalist, Jefferson and Burr Republican. At that point in elections, the person with the most votes becomes president. The person with the second most votes becomes vice president, which is how in 1796 you end up with a Federalist president, John Adams, and a Republican vice president, Thomas Jefferson. What happens in 1800 is that the two Republican candidates tie. Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson tie, and the election gets thrown into the House to decide, with each state getting a vote. to break that tie, and they have to vote. They vote, I believe it's, I can't even remember. I want to say it takes a very long time for that tie to be broken. And as it's not being broken, and as it's unclear if the presidency, what's going to happen to the presidency, all of this talk and anxiety is raised. So I knew before this that there had been talk about arms, but this is what I found this morning, and I want to highlight this because someone said earlier, we don't have to prepare, which might be true, except that, and I'm sure this is true for Heather all the time too, that when you do stop and dig around a little, you always find something that either you haven't seen before, or you have seen it before, but it didn't resonate the same way. So this is what I found this morning. And I don't honestly know if I had found it before or not. I could have, and it played into what I already knew. Perhaps I didn't, because the fact of the matter is, when I was doing my research in 1800, these big databases of correspondence did not exist. So I couldn't have done what I did this morning and like immediately done a targeted search. But so what I found was a letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Monroe from February 15th, 1801. It is not posted yet. It will be posted. I sent a link to Matt not very long ago, which is why it is not up yet. It's my fault entirely. But it's written, it's Jefferson writing to Monroe while the tie is seemingly unbreakable. And I've made this in the smallest font possible, which is really a mistake given my need to see, but I'm going to try to read from it and you'll hear why. So it's a short letter. Jefferson writes to James Monroe, and he says, 4 days of balloting have produced not a single change of vote. He says, it is confidently believed by most that tomorrow there is to be a coalition. I know of no foundation for this belief. But then he goes on and he says, if they, meaning the Federalists, could have been permitted to pass a law for putting the government into the hands of an officer. So in other words, if the Federalists could give the presidency to some officer of government saying, oh, we can't break the tie, let's give it to someone else. Let me find it here. They would certainly have prevented an election. And this is the part that I was interested to see this morning. But we thought it best, and the we is interesting, we thought it best to declare openly and firmly, one and all, that the day such an act passed, the Middle States would arm, and that no such usurpation, even for a single day, should be submitted to. That's quite a statement, right? Like, if the Federalists take this over in a way that feels usurp the election, which is the word that they're using, we told them that the Middle States will arm, and for not one day will that be allowed to pass. That's an amazing statement. And then he goes on to say, blah, 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 blah. This first shook them. Yeah, this first shook them, and they were completely alarmed at the resource for which we declared, to wit, a convention to reorganize the government and to amend it. The very word convention gives them, the Federalists, the horrors, as in the present democratical spirit of America, they fear they should lose some of their favorite morsels of the Constitution. So what's interesting about that, they were shooketh, says Drew. Jefferson says, in no uncertain terms, we let them know that if the Federalists usurp this election in some way, give it to someone else by saying, oh, we can't break the tie. Here, we'll give this person the election either in the interim or not. Middle states will arm, and you will not for one day be allowed for that to happen. That's what shocked me about that was I knew the talk was out there. What I didn't know is, on the one hand, that Jefferson is so aggressively echoing that talk, and the fact that we let it be known. I'd have to look further. I mean, honestly, I was digging around an hour before this and found this letter and thought, wow, that's a lot more direct and aggressive than I remember. But the fact that there was an open threat of armed violence if the election didn't go the way it was supposed to go. And the fact that then Jefferson says, and then we'd have a new constitutional convention and we'd change things so that this doesn't happen again. On the one hand, it shows you to such an extreme degree we talk about contingency here all the time, but how contingent that moment was, how things could have gone in so many different ways, and the echoes of that, the degree to which when you're in a moment like this, when you're in a transition moment, growing from an extreme polarized moment, that those sorts of ideas about urgency drive people to extremes. Heather and I can talk together, or we can do this during the question and answer period, as to what it means, as to who offers those threats and why they're offering them. So does it matter if you're saying, we'll do whatever it takes to keep the election because I want power, versus we'll do whatever it takes to keep the election because they are not going to support the Constitution. There are all kinds of wrinkles so that you can't directly translate from one side to another. But the fact that that was so bluntly there in this election at this early point really sort of took me aback this morning, even before my cup of coffee. Go ahead, Heather.
Well, it's also interesting that that one of the things that's really struck me about this current moment is how important it is to take that public conversation and say, no, don't even think about what you're suggesting, because this is not a close election or anything. And the Biden camp has taken a very different approach to sort of say, oh, forget it, we're not even going to talk about that, which I get, and I understand why they're doing that. But one of the key differences that letter sounds like is Jefferson says we will arm.
Right.
I don't think he's got the problem of the other side having armed sort of rogue militias out there the way that the Biden camp is trying very, very hard not to activate, since they are already suggesting violence.
Right.
And, and there's we all talk about the Second Amendment and how in the original days, everyone was walking around with an armory. And you listen to that letter and it sounds like he's not worried about people right now in that letter taking to the streets with their shotguns. They wouldn't be shotguns in those days, by the way. They'd be muskets and flint loaders, but flintlocks. But that he's not worried about sparking domestic terrorism, because he's not worried about that at all. He's actually talking about organizing into new militias.
Well, and the governors of those states were in on this. So it's even farther removed from militias, right? The governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia, this is something that's coming from the opposite direction of a sort of what they would have called voluntary society, a self-created militia. So no, absolutely. And so, yeah, there was no question, we will arm. He even knew that people were talking about being armed at that point. So he had no question about that. And apparently also, and I only found this secondhand, there was a French observer in Washington at the time who said that there was already a quote unquote mob of, I think he says, impatient people in the street waiting to see what would happen and ready to take action. So this is,
and
this
that was
is
close. That election was closer. I mean, this election is a slam dunk. I mean, this is
right.
Biden's way out ahead in the popular vote and the Electoral College. The 1800 election, Jefferson had already rigged it to begin with by screwing around with the Electoral College. So it was going to be by Virginia was going to vote as a winner take all state, as opposed to continuing with the district rule. So, people really didn't know what was up then. I mean, now it's a little bit different because it's really clear.
Well, absolutely. And I've been thinking about that as our current moment has been unfolding, because in 1800, and that's just the crucial difference, there was an actual tie, right? It's not as though there had been an election and someone had won. There was a tie, a seemingly unbreakable tie, which is a vast difference from the present, where there actually was an election and there actually was a winner. So we're in a very different moment. But the front and center threat of violence in such different cases, but still the fact that it's there is some of what Newbie finds it striking too, is some of what I found really striking. But let's jump ahead in time. Heather, I don't know which election you decided you wanted.
So this works really well because the election that everyone always asks me to talk about 1876, which I'm always happy to do, but in many ways it's very interesting for itself. But the moment that interests me for where we are today is the election of 1892. And the reason for that is that in the election of 1892, so what happened was in 1884, Grover Cleveland is elected. He's a Democrat, and he is elected to lower the tariff, which is the law that is protecting big business in America. And the Republicans go bonkers. So from the minute he's elected in 84, they go out of their way to make sure that he is not reelected. So in 1888, they've done everything. They've stifled the vote. They have told Republican employers have told employees that they'll lose their jobs if Cleveland is reelected. They've invented modern campaign finance so that John Wanamaker, the guy who invents the department store, goes to all the rich guys and says, pony up cash or we're going to have another Democrat. So they do all this, and in 1888, they run Benjamin Harrison as the presidential candidate, and he loses the popular vote by about 100,000 votes. He loses. This is one of the ones people forget about, but he loses, and there's some shenanigans that go on in the New York delegation of the Electoral College. So he gets put in, even though he lost the popular vote. This is 1888. So he takes office in 1889, and under his administration, they do everything they can to promote big business. They literally buy their version of Fox News, and they put this is a businessman's administration on it. And they actually raise the tariff rather than what people want, which is to lower the tariff, because people are aware that tariffs are paid by people inside the country. And what the tariffs mean is that ordinary workers are paying way more for tin and for basically everything than they would if there was foreign competition. So Harrison says, oh, I'm going to reform the tariff. And they raise it. In 1890, they raise it. And and they get decimated in the House of Representatives. And then in 1892, Harrison is so unpopular, and he adds 6 new states to the Union to try and make sure he never loses power. That's when we get North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana and Wyoming and Idaho and the state of Washington. We get all those because the Republicans are trying to pack the Senate and to pack the Electoral College, because it's going to give them theoretically such a leg up in the Electoral College. That's not how it plays out, but that's why they do it. And they say this. I'm not making this up. I could give you thousands of references where they're saying this. So then in the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, wins again. So he's the non-consecutive guy in history, but actually he won the middle one too. But he wins again, and the Senate and the House both go Democratic. So the Republicans, who think that the Democrats having power is going to mean the apocalypse because they're going to destroy the economy by attacking big business, and how familiar does this sound? They recognize that they have lost. They've lost by a lot. But what they do in that transition period is so important. They basically set out to make sure that Cleveland is going to be a disaster. So what they do is they flood the newspapers, many of which are Republican newspapers. They flood the newspapers with op-eds and stories that say Democrats are in control, the economy is going to go down the toilet, everything is terrible. Take your money out of the stock market. Don't invest in everything. We're going to have a depression. We're going to have people thrown out of work. Workers are going to starve to death, and they deserve it. And they and money starts to flow out of the country because the American economy is really propped up right then by British money and European money, and it starts to flow out of the economy at the same time that the Republicans had passed a number of laws to create new statues. That's why we have all those Revolutionary War statues from the 1890s. And to give welfare payments to people who from the Civil War, and they did that because they wanted to justify the tariff as saying we need all this money. So they were spending money as fast as they possibly could. But now, of course, with the economy starting to slow down, the money's not coming in. So the Treasury is getting less and less and less money, and the money is flowing out of the country. And financiers rush to Washington, and they go to the president, and they're like, do something, sell bonds, do something, because the economy is about to crash. And Harrison is like, no, I'm good. And the Secretary of the Treasury, they actually go to him and they say, you must do something. You are driving this country into the ground. And he literally says, I need to keep this country going until March 4th. Which is the day that Cleveland takes office. After that, it's not my problem. And 10 days before Cleveland takes office, if you remember your high school history, everybody's like, Cleveland sucked. He divided the, well, what they don't put in that is that 10 days before he takes office, the economy collapses, completely collapses. And of course, they don't understand deficit spending. They don't understand anything in 1893, which is when this is. This is in late February. And when he takes office in March, he is looking at a full-blown humanitarian crisis, an economic depression, you know, and he has, and the Republicans are like, ha, we told you, and they stuck him with it. And the reason that fascinates me is if you look at everything that is happening right now with this transition, I am not in a position to say that Donald Trump is deliberately screwing over the Biden administration, but when Biden takes the hold of the reins, right now he doesn't have access to the intelligence reports, although one assumes he's going to get them, which means he can't put his team in place because he can't get security clearances, and he you know, right now he doesn't have access to the State Department, and coronavirus is, like I said to my partner this morning, if Trump were trying to cause more damage, like what would he be doing? Right now, every single state in the union except Vermont is in the red, we're in serious trouble range. So the reason that I'm fascinated by this is because I think the reason that, and it worked, by the way, you know, this is where we get the idea that Democrats can't handle the economy, is from this.
Here's my question, Heather. So there's rhetoric, there's an impact. It's clearly like, good, let's destroy it and then hand it over to them. Do you happen to know in private correspondence, apart from the public rhetoric, what these people are saying about what they're doing?
They know exactly what they're doing. So what happens is the Secretary of the Treasury, the last thing he does is he's going to go to Europe after his term, and he goes and he gives an interview to the newspaper right before he leaves office, and he's going to Europe. And he goes, oh, by the way, that Treasury you're worried about, it's at rock bottom. Bye, see ya. You know. And
but do they talk at all about, not that they, of course they know, which you have made clear, which is wonderful. What my question is are they saying behind the scenes, yeah, we're kind of screwing the country over? But
they think it's a good thing. They're going to get rid of the Democrats once and for all, because
regardless of the impact.
They really believe that the Democrats are going to destroy the economy. And the reason that this is instructive at this moment for many reasons, but I think what is really instructive is that it has gone into our history books that Grover Cleveland was a profound screw up and that the Democrats didn't understand how to run the economy. And this is entirely constructed. So one of the things that I feel like we need to inoculate ourselves against is the idea that somehow when Biden takes over, this is his problem. I mean, he, like the Obama administration of which he was a part, was doing cleanup, and he is seriously going to be doing cleanup. I mean, on coronavirus alone, you know, we are so far behind where we need to be. So that election is, as I say, it wasn't contested at the time because it was so overwhelming, but the fallout from that we are literally still living with, because this is where the idea that Democrats are going to destroy the economy really takes root. And from it we get the Panic of 1893, which is the first major nationwide panic, and there's strikes all over the country and things are disaster, and Cleveland calls out the troops, and it's terrible. And in the midterm elections of 94, the Republicans go in front of the country and they say, we told you. And they get put back in Congress in what was, until very recently, it might have been changed recently, the largest landslide midterm election in history. And Americans are like, God, you're right, the Democrats suck. And they then put the Republicans back in power, and the Republicans say, oh my God, this is great. Everything's going to be fine now. And the Panic of 1893 goes away because everyone's like, oh, you're right, you're back in charge, and the money flows back into the country. I mean, it's a completely constructed crisis.
So we're looking at, between you and I, we're looking at threats of violence and strategic destructive behavior as ways of trying to ways of trying to shift the outcome or the impact of an election, right? So, you know, I can already see people saying, you know, on the one hand, I'm relieved that, and this is always the way I feel, being someone who writes about political violence and political crises, people will respond by saying either, I'm relieved to know that this has happened before, which is sort of okay, but sort of not, because no two crises are the same. So you know, when people say I'm relieved, I sort of think, well, yes, history always provides insight. And then part of me thinks, but it worked just because we sort of got through it once. Doesn't mean, you know, this gets me back to harping on contingency and the idea that we don't know what outcomes are right now just because we know past outcomes. We're looking at patterns, and it is interesting and in a sense edifying to understand the ways in which these things have worked before. But, you know, someone asked me recently, you know, to predict what comes next, and I refused, right? It's like, I don't know, you know, I mean, I could make a prediction based on what, you know, I think this is such an unknown moment that I almost think making predictions is a little irresponsible on the part of a historian, because, you know, I can say it was a real election and there was someone chosen and that's what should happen. But as far as to what unfolds, you know, I can guess, but I don't know.
Well, isn't 1800 unique too in that that after they picked Jefferson, lots of people who had said, you know, he's the Antichrist, basically, are like, well, you know, he's there's that wonderful quotation from Hamilton that's like this long, where he's like, you know, it's like every adjective for he's the worst person in the world, and he's like, but you know what? At the end of the day, he's so into who he is, you know, into power, he's gonna be fine.
That's before the election, though. But yes, or before the tie breaking. But yeah, what he basically says is Burr is so horrible that, you know, Jefferson compared to him is great, and he's a hypocrite, and he has a list of insults. He says, but all that said, he's better than Burr. You're right. But then the Federalists, for a moment, many of them at least, step back and say, okay, you know, let's see. Jefferson's famous inaugural address says, you know, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. There's an attempt to sort of,
once he's already in power.
Exactly. Surprise. And now we're all the same. He does do that. And one of the things that I will be posted online later is something, and this is what I went looking for, and then I stumbled across this other thing instead. Jefferson writes a letter. So immediately, not surprising, he becomes president, and he's faced with every officer of government is Federalist, and now we have a Republican administration, and he needs to, as you know, as he's arguing, understandably, some of the people in power and locally have to be Republicans. I can't be a Republican president with an entirely Federalist administrative network around the country. So he begins to, you know, replace some people, and of course, there's a Federalist uproar about this. How dare you remove our people from power? And then he's faced again with another aspect of a transition of power. What you will be able to see later online is he writes a letter, he writes an essay titled Fair Play, which he sends to someone and says, rewrite it so it's not in my handwriting and make it sound like a New Englander and get it published in New England newspapers, telling people why this is fair. Right? Why it's fair that Jefferson is taking some Federalists out of office, which I find remarkable, right? It's Jefferson saying, yeah, I'm going to pretend to be someone from Massachusetts, and I'm going to go in Northern papers and say, no, this Jefferson guy, like, it's kind of fair. Let him do what he's doing.
Did it happen? Did it get published?
Yeah, it did. We don't, so Jefferson sends it to the guy and says, tweak it so that it sounds New Englandy, because I don't know how to do that. And we don't have, you can look at the final version of it, and you can look at Jefferson's version of it and kind of see differences and edits, but we don't know about that process. But what will be posted later is Jefferson's letter saying, would you do this for me? And the actual essay, the Fair Play essay about Jefferson trying to sound like a New England Federalist. So people will feel better about Jefferson as president. It's just, you know, Jefferson makes such a big deal about being the, you know, I do not write for the newspapers, blah, blah, blah. And a couple of times he does. At least two of them, I think, when he's president. So anyway.
Hey, we ought to specify here that the Jeffersonian Republicans are a completely different kettle of fish than the Republicans from the 1850s, which is our current day Republican Party, and which did in fact reach back to that name solely because they were trying to grab the legacy of the Declaration of Independence. But we both are using the word Republican, and it's
Jeffersonian
entirely different.
And that's a good reminder. And I do.
And Newbie agrees.
Newbie totally gets it. I do normally say Jeffersonian Republicans for that very reason. But let's open things up.
I was gonna say, I hate to be Professor Killjoy again, but we do have some questions here for you.
But before we do that, we need to look behind you, and I need to hold up a mug. Right? Tom says mug reveal. Okay. Mug reveal. So I must say that I do not remember who sent me this mug. This mug was sent to me. It seemed ideal for today. As always, I get lipstick on these darn mugs. So I will read it and then hold it up. It says, funny, I don't recall asking for your opinion. Given that we're looking at an election with actual votes and data, this is what I thought was appropriate for today. It's interesting that you have an opinion on the election. We actually have data and ballots and votes. So this is my thematic mug of the day. And thank you. Hopefully someone will beam in and tell me who sent this to me. I feel horrible that I do not. I get a box with mugs in it and I don't always know who sent them. So thank you, person who sent me the mug. Matt, tell us, although I have a feeling I understand, but still Matt has to reveal his background and explain it.
Yeah, but I went a little obvious this week, but and Tom got it right away. But one of the Toms, I should say, got it early on in the chat before we started recording. One of my favorite sort of iconic images of transitions of power is when the former president leaves via what was Marine One, and it's some very symbolic moment, and so I just got Marine One on the south lawn. Obviously, it's not a January picture, but it's actually remarkably hard to find a picture of Marine One just sitting there. And the credit for this goes to the AP. So,
thank you, Matt. Well, I mean, obvious. You hardly ever do that, so I think you're totally allowed. Normally, I have to guess, which is good. I think, given today's topic, obvious is necessary. So
good.
Okay, so
yeah. Sometimes I do go a long way for the background, and I did not do that.
He does.
So, all right, so let's get to some questions here. And as always, I do have to filter through these, just those of you who are with us for the first time. We do try to be as nonpartisan as possible here, and sometimes, given the political conditions of the world, we naturally ask political questions. So, so apologies if I reframe your questions for our esteemed panelist here. I've taught about the setup. This is from Kevin Klein, tag member. Kevin Klein, welcome. I've taught about the setup of POTUS and Veep, and students often ask why this was the original setup, and I feel like I never have a good enough answer. What was the thinking behind the setup of POTUS and Veep?
Meaning, is that a question about the election and why initially whoever had the most votes becomes president and whoever has the second most becomes vice president?
That's the way I'm reading it.
Okay, and he says bingo. Okay,
yeah.
Well, so part of the answer to that is there was no assumption that there would be political parties, right? So when they're writing the Constitution, they're not assuming there will be one party with a ticket and another party with a ticket. They just assume, well, men will run, and then the man who gets the most electoral votes will win, and the one who gets the second most will win. And I think they can't be from the same state, or you can't vote for two people from the same state if you're an elector. But if you think about it, without parties, there isn't really a reason why that wouldn't work. It would just be two individuals who are selected among all others as being the two best. So that's the main reason why. And I mean, if you're teaching about it, it's a great way to show that the founders really were not thinking about, a party system in any way, and that what we take for granted about the way our politics works was just not a part of the scene in the early years of the government. It just, parties were seen as, and I always laugh when I say this, parties were seen as collections of men working for their own interests and not for the good of the country, right? And for that reason, parties were bad, and you never wanted to be a party. And so you see in correspondence in the 1790s, a lot of the elite saying, like Jefferson, they dare to call us a party, they're a party, we're not a party. So party is bad. And that's a perfect example of that.
Well, and that's also why our electoral college is so bizarre, and also why impeachment has turned out to be so bizarre. Because again, if you strip the partisanship out of those things, the system looks great. I mean, the idea of the Senate in impeachment organizing itself as a trial, it's a no-brainer, unless people are dividing according to political loyalties as opposed to loyalty to the country. And that's one of the things that I think is something we really kind of need to grapple with in some ways, because once you add the party system, which I'm a huge fan of, by the way, but once you add in the party system, it changes the equation of those two really crucial aspects of our government.
This, I believe, is a question for Heather. Thomas Mackey is asking, what are the best books or book on the Panic of 1893 and the Republican modifications to the national economy?
So that's a great question. And the reason that that I got so into the Panic of 1893, which sounds so bizarre, but welcome to the life of a historian. Is
This is our
That's such a
world.
historian answer right there.
This is our world. Yeah.
Exactly. It's because there really isn't a lot on it. I wrote about it in my book on the Republican Party, and I got completely fascinated by it. And I will tell you, I think why there isn't anything great on it yet, although there should be soon, I would think, is because two things. First of all, that the people who tended to look at it were economic historians who looked at the data, underlying data, and saying, well, you know, the economy is unstable, but no more unstable in the 1890s than it was in the late 1880s or after it heals. So what created that? And basically, most of them sort of throw up their hands and say, we don't know. And the thing that I had to my advantage was that we have now newspaper databases. So I remember doing this. I literally sat at my dining room table in my pajamas for 2 straight days. And, you know, that means I basically don't stand up. And I read through the coming of the panic from the election to when it happened. And I could read about, 12 newspapers day by day, and you could watch it spreading. And that was really not possible for a historian to do until very, very recently. So I think we're going to get a reworking of that, but don't really have one yet. So the places to go for late 19th century economy are actually places like my own book on Wounded Knee, for example. But one of my favorites is Eric Rauchway's book, Murdering McKinley, because he actually patterned it on the movie Citizen Kane, and I patterned my Wounded Knee on Eric's book, and in which the event happens. I think it's in the first 17 pages, and then the entire rest of the book is explaining why it happens. And that window, I actually disagree with his conclusion, but his trip through the late 19th century economy is absolutely gripping, because it turns out there was a detective who actually went around trying to figure out why Chalgos had murdered McKinley. And so he follows this detective as he goes around the country and talks about what the world looks like in about 1900.
I want to mention just something that I see came on in chat, just in case folks have missed it. It says, if anyone is interested, a group of Virginia educators is sponsoring a workshop Monday on peaceful transitions of power and how we might foster civil discourse in the classroom. And there's a link there. Annie Evans has posted it there. So if folks are interested, it's there right now, and it's kind of was just posted. There's only a few things after it. Someone says, Heather in pajamas. Someone is seconding Heather in pajamas. Heather, if you
it's actually a J. Jill shirt, but I know it looks like pajamas.
No, I think they're thinking about you in pajamas reading about the election.
Yeah, well, Joanne will tell you that when historians get obsessed with something, we're kind of unshakable.
Right.
And it's just amazing, because you watch this world come to life around you.
And you find the puzzle pieces, and you don't want to step up away from it, because you might lose a piece. You have to keep so no, I've done the same thing. I remember finishing my first book and tracking details at the end and sitting at my dining room table with everything spread out. And when I got tired, I would put my head down for a moment, and then I would pick up and I would keep going, because I didn't want to lose track. So I want to quickly just answer a quick question, and then we can go back. The one, someone said, is it true that Adams was trying to usurp the election? I only want to answer that because the answer is no. He definitely did not. I mean, he understood, as many did, the importance of the process. These are the people who created the process and understood that it was important for that process to be supported, particularly with a new constitution. I want to answer it only because there's a wonderful piece of evidence that I tend to use whenever I talk about the election of 1800, and it's proof of this being true. John Adams writes a letter to Abigail before it's a tie, but when it's unclear what's happening, and he says to her something. He basically says, "I'm living in like a dark night of the soul," because he's worried about not winning the presidency, and then he says, "I can almost accommodate myself to the idea of," and then the next few words are all capital letters and about 3 times as big as everything else, "Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States." So it's like he cannot accommodate himself. Yeah. He's like, ah. But he certainly understood that if that was what happened, there was no question that he was going to assume that that's what the election decided, that's what the people decided, and he would go ahead with that.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Joanna, here's a question for you about that.
Uh-oh.
Like, I wonder if those guys were more willing to let the chips fall because they felt less in power, or empowered, if you will, than today's leaders who have been in power for 1,000,000 years and who are quite old in the scheme of things. So I don't know how old your guys were in this period, but maybe if you've wielded power for 78 years, the way Mitch McConnell does, you sort of feel like after me the deluge. Whereas in those days, with death rates much higher and with, people coming and going more, they're more like, well, it's out of my hands. It's in God's hands. We'll just see how this plays out.
And I think that's right, but I also think elections were just an extreme version of all the time, right? If you're in the 1790s, any stupid decision is going to bring it down. Newby firmly agrees with this.
That's right.
They were constantly in a state of worrying that everything was going to go down. So elections, in a sense, were on a spectrum of angst in this time period. And so I think that was part of it, was that ultimately, to some degree, about many things in national governance, there had to be a sort of, I'm going to try to do this, but in the end, after we've done all that we can do, we'll have to step back and see what happens. And they're kind of determining for the first time if the process actually works in some of these moments of crisis.
And thank you very much for that. That was a great question. And also thank you, Joanne, for tackling that Adams question. That was actually my next question for you. So it worked out
Sorry.
really, really nicely. So
I thought I could knock it out of the way really quickly.
You knocked it right out. It's great. So Richard asks, did Cleveland's continued support for gold, quote unquote, in the panic contribute to the rise of the Bryan Silver inflationist populist wing of the party by 1896?
Okay, so that's a really complicated question. For what's at stake here is that, and by the way, I jumped on that because I love financial questions. Nobody ever asks them, and they're really important. So what's at stake in the 1890s is that the Republican Party likes the idea of gold money, basically, or the banknotes that rely on gold, national banknotes. And the people who are borrowers, lenders like gold because it stays at par. Borrowers, like farmers and workers, like the idea of silver or the greenbacks, which are inflationary, because it means that as they depreciate, you can pay back loans at with much less money than you borrowed them at. So everything all the political aspects of the country start to form around whether you like gold or whether you like silver. And so Cleveland, when he is elected in 92, is backed by the Silverites, the people who want an inflationary currency. And that doesn't necessarily mean silver coins, but there's two kinds of paper money in the country, one that's backed by gold and one that's backed by nothing except the government's willingness to pay it. So what happens is when the market crashes 10 days before he gets into office, as I say, Cleveland did not understand how a deficit economy worked. So he actually gets in office, and what he needs to do, what everybody tells me he has to do, is calm the investors on Wall Street. So rather than going ahead and backing silver and backing an inflationary currency, the issue on which he was elected, he tries to calm Wall Street by backing the monetary policies he likes. And so if you remember your textbooks, it says the Democratic Party split. It does. It splits right out of the box because they're like, darn it, we've elected you based on the idea that we were going to have a looser currency, which is going to be better for us ordinary Americans. And the first thing you do is you sell us out to Wall Street. And this is one of the parallels that I've never actually put in writing, but has interested me a lot, is for a long time, I looked at the Obama administration as one that in the history books might look a lot like the Cleveland administration, because, that he too tried to calm Wall Street. And I think the reasons for that were slightly different, but that's why there is a split. And that is, in fact, one of the things that really powers the rise of the Silver Party, which people always forget about. It's based out of Nevada, the Silver Party. And the Silver Party is one of those that's going to back William Jennings Bryan, who is also backed by the People's Party, the Populist Party, and eventually the Democratic Party. And that split over money right there is really driven by that crash of the economy in 93? Thank you for making my day with that question.
I love having you here, Heather.
I know everybody cares about money, but nobody cares about monetary history.
Right.
What I love is your joy in that. This is a place where the joy of little things that are big things in history must be celebrated. So I appreciate that.
Melissa asks, in the absence of a party system, how did the framers imagine that the legislature would operate? Did they imagine that there would be temporary alliances between legislators?
Well, the short answer is that yes, they understood that there would be differences of opinion, that there would be differences of ideology. They understood after a while that there were, I always call them big umbrellas of ideology, right? That there was a Federalist umbrella and a Republican umbrella, and people sometimes crossed over. They understood that. But the idea that people throughout all of the states, which kind of, before that had been sort of nation state-ish, that all of those people would agree on one candidate or one thing in some predictable, constant way was just not something that they assumed. I mean, think about the ever famous Federalist 10 by Madison, in which he's basically saying in a big republic, you've got lots of interests bouncing around and bouncing off of each other, and that will work. That's more along the lines of how they thought politics would work, rather than that things would break down into parties. And one of the things that shocks them about the election of 1800 is the fact that the country seemed to divide into parties. They also seemed to be regional, sectional. And a lot of people, particularly surprised Federalists, but a lot of people in response to the election of 1800 say, wow, that was bad because the nation divided. Like a big lie, right? A popular election of a president is a bad thing. Let's change that. That was a more Federalist argument than a Jeffersonian Republican argument, but still, they assumed that there would be more bouncing around. You have things like, there's a Hamilton letter towards the end of his time as Secretary of the Treasury, and he writes to someone and says something along the lines of, let's call a vote on this because I want to see where people fall. I want to know who's on my side. So it's, I've talked about political warfare in this period being kind of like a war without uniforms, because no matter what someone's politics were, there might be a local issue or a personal issue or a personal connection in which someone would flip or flop because what we now understand as sort of party loyalty wasn't quite there yet in this period. And even someone like Hamilton is like, Federalists need to prove themselves right now because I'm not sure who is one.
I always think of it like a faculty meeting, or any time that you have a group of people together in a business, like faculties never divide like A and Z. There's like on each question there'll be a majority and a minority, but boy, the work and the who's on which side for each different question, they're all different questions, and there really is not. In any healthy faculty anyway, there is
that's the key.
I was gonna say.
I have to say there was one exception in the 20 however many years I've been at Yale. There was one issue that was the department was clearly like divided in half. There was like a yes and a no, which I didn't know. And I walked into the meeting, it was already going on, and I sat down, and I realized after I sat down, the yeses were on one side and the no's were on the other side. And I was a yes sitting with the no's. And I was like, oh no, like, what do I do? Like, do I get up and like slink over to the other side? I was like, or do I spy? Like maybe I can overhear what the other side is saying. But you're right, that very much is faculty meeting, healthy faculty meeting, yes.
Well, it's just funny because often people who are not aware of that make assumptions about how different people vote because they're like, wow, that person was against me on the last question. And it's like, by the time you're senior faculty and you actually see how things come out, you're like, boy, did you call that one wrong because your enemies were actually your friends and your friends were actually your enemies on that one.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I, again, hate to be Professor Kildrew, but we are out of time.
Yeah.
So I will quickly give my spiel here and then let you both have final thoughts before we move to our after party, which those of you which Joanna will explain here in a moment, but those of you who are new will learn a little bit more. thank you both for your time here, and on behalf of the National Council for History Education, we are blessed to have two thoughtful academic researchers, citizens to think through these incredible issues. And if you do like our work, then please go to our website when it is functioning. Apparently we had so many people that crashed it today, so that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Our website is www.ncheteach.org, and you can catch all of the episodes of this show on our conversations page. You can also find them all on our YouTube page, find them all on our Facebook page. So we have lots of avenues for you to watch us if you weren't able to log in, or if you want to watch this again. It's just wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thank you both, and I'll turn it over to you to close out the time.
Okay. First, I want to just thank Heather so much for joining us. I love Thursday mornings. I always say this. I love the History Matters community. I love working with Matt. I love having you here. As always, it's just too much fun. And as shown by the fact that we couldn't stop talking at the beginning.
So I was just going to say, isn't this the great part that for once we get to be the misbehaving students, and we have this poor man who's got to be like, you guys need to get on topic. You're getting off topic again.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you so much, Heather. I also want to say, as I always say, I appreciate everyone who's here and who makes this a community where we can discuss these kinds of things every Thursday morning, where we can ask questions, where we can debate things, where we can have the kind of discourse that we always do. I will say, as Matt suggested, we are now going to segue into the after party. For those of you who are new, we basically stop recording and we can be a little less formal in the after party and sort of open things up a little bit. So we segue into something else. It's not recorded, so you cannot find it afterwards like you can find the conversation that Heather and I just had. The last thing I'll say before giving Heather the final word is, I do want to say, given that we just spent an hour talking about the political process, I just want to put out there and remind everyone, we just had an election. It just had an outcome. And that matters, right? The political process matters. And that might seem like a strikingly obvious thing to say, but I think it needs to be said. And I'm all over Twitter constantly saying that because I think there are so many efforts to erase that statement, and it can't be erased, really. So I will now, Heather, let you.
Well, I have nothing to say except one, I agree, and two, thank you. This is always so much. It is so much fun, and thank you, Matt, as well for facilitating all this. And now we party, right?
Yeah, now we party. Bye, everybody. I'm gonna turn off our streams.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming.